Welcome to the part 5 of the International Christian University Linguistic Colloquium. It's organized with the theme Prosody. I'm Seunghun from International Christian University. Today we have two exciting talks by Emily Elfner at Yale University and Natalie Weber at Yale University. Let me introduce Dr. Emily Elfner first. Emily is an assistant professor in the linguistic program in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics at York University. Her primary research interests are in prosody and the syntax-phonology interface. In a recent research project, she is investigating the prosody and intonation of Kwakwala, an endangered First Nation language spoken in British Columbia, Canada. She also works on has worked on the prosody of Irish and Blackfoot. Emily and I met actually as part of the same NSF-funded project on syntax prosody interface whose the PI was Lisa Selkirk at the time, and then we were in the project for a few years, and then since then we've known each other. And in her work, especially her dissertation and subsequent work on Irish prosody, has been influential in helping us to understand more about the relationship between prosody and syntax, not just on Irish, but cross-linguistically. It's good to have you here at ICULINC, and today Emily will talk about evaluating evidence for covert prosodic structure.
All right, thank you so much. So I'll share my screen then.
You can see your screen, yeah.
Okay, great. And hopefully I unmuted myself as well. So, all right, so thank you so much for that introduction. It was really nice, and it's really nice to be here as well. So today I'm going to be talking about sort of a more theoretical topic, but also drawing on some of my past work on Irish. There's some things that I've been thinking about in terms of prosodic theory. Right. So, as you likely know, the syntax prosody interface is primarily concerned with understanding this relationship between syntactic structure and prosodic phrasing. So one aspect of this work, which almost seems maybe too obvious, is that we are trying to detect where prosodic boundaries are. So mostly what we do is we look for phonetic and phonological cues to phrase edges or to phrase domains. However, if you look at a lot of work on the syntax prosody interface, such as work by Selkirk, we actually see that we actually only have partial evidence for prosodic phrase structure in a given language. And so what we see is that, which I'll illustrate in a bit, is that we have sort of an underspecification of certain types of phrase boundaries. And this seems to be actually kind of at odds with what is assumed in much of the literature on psycholinguistics and other types of approaches to intonation. So basically, this would be conflicting with an idea that in order to have evidence for prosodic boundary, we have to have some kind of overt, phonetic or phonological cue. So this is what I sort of a type of diagnostics I've seen a lot in work on psycholinguistic literature, or maybe on sort of intonation-first approaches to intonation. So basically, this gives us two different types of approaches to work on the relationship between syntactic and prosodic phrasing. So we see we have sort of a bottom-up approach, where syntax is going to make predictions about the locations of boundaries. And so in this sense, phonetics and phonology provide sufficient but not necessary evidence for the existence of these boundaries. And so what this means is that we might have boundaries that are present but not actually overtly marked. The top-down approach, on the other hand, suggests that phonetics and phonology provide necessary evidence for the existence of prosodic boundaries. So syntax prosody mapping is sort of a secondary issue, so if it's an issue at all. So basically, we're just looking for these overt boundaries, and this will sort of tell us where there's sort of a break between two phrases. So in this talk, I'm going to just be thinking about some of these arguments for prosodic boundaries in this sort of bottom-up and top-down approach. And what I'm going to be focusing on is a case study from Irish, which seems to show an apparent contradiction between these two types of approaches. So basically, what we'll see is that there's two different kinds of cues to prosodic phrase edges that we can look at in Irish, but sort of on the surface, they seem to provide contradictory evidence with respect to the strength of these boundaries. All right, so let's just talk a little bit about some background. So as I mentioned, syntax prosody interface is looking at this relationship between syntactic constituent structure and prosodic phrasing. However, there are many different types, many different interpretations of what we mean by prosodic phrasing. So the way that I'll be thinking about it is prosodic phrasing has to do with the ways in which phonological units, such as segments, syllables, words, phrases, are going to be organized into rhythmic groups. So specifically, how do we detect the presence of these prosodic phrases? We look for things like phonetic or phonological cues, like pauses, lengthening, or pitch scaling, tonal or intonational cues, so for example, pitch accents, boundary tones, segmental processes, so things like spreading that might occur within a certain domain, and possibly other types of cues as well. So if we're thinking about these different types of approaches, in terms of all the different kinds of approaches that have been proposed over the years, I'm going to talk about two. So one is going to be this notion of edge marking, in which we have prosodic phrases that are assumed to have a left and a right edge. And these are going to be detectable to cues which specifically target these left or right edges. And so this is what's familiar from, for example, Selkirk's work, or work by Nesper and Vogel and many others who worked within this framework. What I'm calling a sort of juncture-based approach is this idea that prosodic phrases are detectable based on sort of an edgeless prosodic boundary between two words. So this is something like, if we notice there's a pause between two words, we can hypothesize that there's a break there, but we don't necessarily say that that pause is marking a left or right edge. It's really just marking a division. So in principle, we can see that prosodic phrase boundaries are going to be detectable based on these types of phonological processes. So if we're thinking about this edge-based marking approach, we can look at some examples in the literature. So I want to talk a little bit about this example from Chimwini, just to sort of show what we mean by this prosodic phrase structure that's not going to be overtly marked. So in Chimwini, we have two diagnostics for the right edge of a phonological phrase. So first of all, there's going to be vowel length. So long vowels will surface in a penultimate syllable if the word is at the right edge of a phi. Okay, with the caveat that an anti-penultimate syllable will be lengthened if the penultimate is light. And then we also have a phrasal H tone, which is going to surface on that penultimate syllable if the words can be at the right edge of a phi. And so phi in this sense is used as just a phonological phrase boundary. And so here we have a couple of sentences which are quoted from Selkirk 2011. And so what we see is that we have, for example, in this sentence, she bought a book and a table. We have a lengthened or a long vowel surfacing, and we get this sort of boundary between them. Okay. And so we hypothesize that whenever we see this long vowel, we get this boundary, in addition to the high pitch accent. And so what Selkirk proposes in older work is that these are cues to the diagnostics for the right edge of the phonological phrase. Right? So the hypothesis is that these are actually telling us something about a right edge marking. And so the way that this is represented is using this right parentheses, which is going to tell us that it's a right boundary. However, so far we don't have any evidence for the left edges, and so the idea is that, what do we do about these? And so basically, in this kind of framework, the idea is that this right edge boundary is going to just necessitate the presence of a left edge boundary. So in this 1986 work, what we get is these left edge boundaries are just going to occur basically wherever we need a left edge boundary. So basically, this one, it has a right edge. It's going to go all the way until we hit another right edge. And so we'll make that left edge boundary. So the reason for this is that we have certain assumptions, such as the strict layer hypothesis, which doesn't allow us to have recursion. So how does this relate to syntax prosody mapping? So the idea proposed by Selkirk is that we have these two diagnostics for right edges of phi. And so this is going to be predicted by a type of alignment constraint, which is going to match up these right edges of xp's in the syntax to the right edges of phi. And so that can be formalized with a constraint as below. And so what this means, if we compare this phrasing to the syntactic structure, so this is what's represented here, what we get is a match between the right edges of these xp's with the right edges of these phis. And so again, we don't have any direct evidence for these left edge boundaries. Okay. And so we end up having edges that we don't really have overtly marked. We can sort of deduce that they're present based on our theory. So under this approach, it's assumed basically that languages will overtly mark some phrase edges, but not all. So there's going to be overt evidence in Chimwini for right edge boundaries, and syntactic evidence that's going to help us predict where they occur. But there's not going to be any overt evidence for these left edge boundaries. So these are where I get the sort of covert evidence, right? So basically we need to fill in that these edges exist based on the assumption that we have these left and right edges. So if there's a right edge, there must be a left edge somewhere as well. This is made even more apparent in match theory. So match theory is another approach to syntax prosody mapping that was proposed by Selkirk in 2011. And in this theory, what we get is the idea that the left and the right edges of syntactic constituents correspond to prosodic boundaries. And so what this results in is that we have even more underspecified boundaries in a language like Chimwini. So if we look at the Chimwini example again, what we see is we've got here, we've got our syntactic structure. And so the match approach basically says that there should be a boundary for every prosodic constituent. So we've got one left edge boundary here, two here, then we have our right edge, left edge, and then we've got three right edges because we've got three phrase boundaries. Same thing here, we've got, again, left edge, and then, an inner boundary, and more boundaries. So you can see in terms of match, we've got more boundaries, but because we assume that these two diagnostics in Chimwini, so the long vowels and the pitch accent, these are marking the right edges. And so all we really need to do is say this is where the right edge occurs, and then we can sort of fill in the rest based on the syntax. So this is starting to become more of a bottom-up approach where we've got sort of the syntactic structure making predictions about where boundaries are, even if we don't necessarily have direct evidence for them. And so what I see is that we've got match theory basically allows recursion to occur, so we get this nested structure. And so as I mentioned, that means we get these additional left boundaries, additional right boundaries, and this is, at least hypothetically, is going to be marked in the same way as the less detailed structure. A juncture-based approach, on the other hand, might mark the evidence for the prosodic boundary, but wouldn't necessarily give us any information about left or right edges. Right, so it basically would say, if we want to take a really radical approach, is that we've got evidence for a boundary here and here, but all it really tells us is that there's a division between these sort of chunks of the utterance. And so these two approaches give us different kinds of information. So basically a juncture approach is going to be agnostic as to whether or not we have edges. So basically just have a beginning and an end. The edge approach is going to assume that we need edges to make prosodic domains. So basically we're going to have phonological processes that are going to target left or right edges. And it also implies that we'll have edges that aren't going to be sort of overt. So some advantages or disadvantages. So one advantage is that we have, in the edge-based approach, a way to really interpret syntactic structure in a very direct way. So basically, we know, if we know something about the syntax, we can make predictions about how the prosodic structure should look. And then we can sort of compare that to what we see in the phonetics and phonology. In terms of juncture, this isn't going to really tell us anything about syntax prosody mapping constraints, but we might be able to look at things like relative boundary strength to see how strong or how long these boundaries are, because we do know that there's evidence that boundaries can be of different strengths. And so some questions that I have about this is really thinking about juncture, whether this is a way to mark a prosodic edge, or is it telling us something different, for example, about speech processing? And there's no real reason that we expect prosodic edges and juncture to be necessarily two separate theories, right? So we might expect that languages might use both of these types of tools, and maybe we can see whether or not they agree with each other. Okay, so this is where we think about things like necessary and sufficient diagnostics. So do we need these prosodic cues, or can we get away with having some things that are sort of less specified? So some theoretical implications. So according to this sort of Selkirk type theory, we would have a universal property of language, which would involve this syntax prosody mapping. And then we would have language-specific components, which would determine how phonetics and phonology actually interprets these structures. So this would involve some edges being marked and some not, and also what kind of strategies are used. So what it would follow is that when we're looking at different languages, we're only ever going to get sort of a partial picture in any language. And so we really need to be able to keep in mind that we're going to have this partial picture. This is also true of any mismatches. So we need to be able to figure out when we have a conflict between syntactic and prosodic structure. So in a sense, the syntactic structure is sort of like a blueprint for prosodic structure, in the sense that it sort of gives us the possible locations of prosodic boundaries, and then phonetics and phonology will give us clues to where these occur. And so this really assumes a key role for syntactic structure. Okay, so I want to talk about Irish. And so the reason I want to talk about Irish is that it does actually, I think, produce an interesting case. And so this is based actually on work that I've done at two different sort of stages of my career. So one of them involved work deriving from my dissertation, where I looked at how pitch accents can mark prosodic boundaries in Irish, and how this relates to syntactic structure. And the other is from an experiment that I did, which looks at where we see this kind of juncture occurring between subjects and objects in Irish. So I'll talk more about how that works in a bit. And the interesting thing is that if we were to look at either of these independently, we might think that they actually don't agree with each other. So a little bit of background on Irish. So Irish is a VSO language, so verb, subject, object, constituent order in basic sentences. On the left, we have a syntactic tree. So this is based on work by McCloskey. And so in this structure, if you're not a syntactician, that's okay, but basically what we see is that we have a verb that moves very high in the tree all the way up until it's an initial position of the sentence. We have a subject that's going to occur after the verb or just below the verb. And then we have our object, which is going to sort of stay low in the sentence. And that'll give us that verb, subject, object, word order. So on the right, what we have is a sort of reduced syntactic structure where I've just taken out, all of these traces. The idea that prosody is going to be looking at things that are overt, not these traces. And so what we see is that in the syntax, we have a constituent that's going to form, sort of group together the subject and the object. So if we're looking at syntax as sort of our blueprint, what we've got is this subject-object constituent that we're predicting might be preserved in the prosodic structure. So some of the work that I did, so I won't be talking about the details too much today, but basically the idea is that when we have transitive sentences in Irish, so verb, subject, object, if we actually manipulate the size of the subject between, for example, 1 versus 2 words. So for example, if we had a noun or a noun and an adjective together, we would get different results. So what we see is that on the left, we have the syntactic constituency, so we expect that to stay the same, whether we have a noun and adjective or simply a noun. But in terms of the prosody, what I showed is that when we have a 2-word subject, so like a noun and an adjective, we would get the phrasing that looks a lot like the syntax. We'd have a constituent here with noun and adjective, and then a larger constituent grouping together the subject and the object, versus in the case with the 1-word subject, we would get the verb and the subject instead phrasing together. And so this is a type of mismatch where we get sort of prosodic preference grouping together the verb and the subject, even though they aren't a constituent in the syntax. And so what we see in Irish is that what I argued is that there is overt phonological evidence for both the left and right phonological phrase edges. So specifically, we have what I called an L star H pitch accent, which marks the left edge of a recursive phonological phrase, and a H star L, so a falling tone. So this would be sort of a rising pitch versus a falling pitch, which is going to occur at the right edge of a phonological phrase. And so Irish actually has a lot more evidence compared to other languages such as Chinwini, because it does have a left and a right edge diagnostic, but still there won't be any evidence for these left edge of non-recursive phrases. And so we see, if we look at, this is just the prosodic structure, okay? And so this is a tree structure just showing that when we have the prosody, so this is represented by these phi constituents. When we have a verb and a single word subject, they're going to phrase together, okay? And we can also see that here. Versus when we have a 2-word subject, so this being our subject here, it's going to make its own phrase and then also form a constituent with the object. And so the reason that we can tell this is because we have this L star H, which basically maps a left edge. So basically left edge, right edge, and then right edge over here. And so it's really the presence of this left edge marker, this rising pitch accent, that's telling us that there's this phrase boundary in between the verb and the subject. And so basically what I argued is that there's these overt cues that will illustrate this nested structure from the syntax being preserved in the prosodic phrasing. And so what I argued in Irish is that prosodic phrasing provides a pretty good diagnostic for syntactic structure, at least in cases where the subject is sort of big enough, which provides support for the type of syntactic work that had been done by people like McCloskey, right? So we have this independent syntactic work, and then comparing it to the prosody, we can sort of see where they match up, and it turned out the match was pretty good. On the other hand, I'd also observed, and it's been observed in literature as well, that there seems to be what we might call a prosodic juncture between the subject and the object in a VSO sentence. So basically, a prosodic break between the subject and object. And so I'd always thought this was kind of a strange phenomenon because, of course, I'd seen that evidence that subject and object phrase together in many cases. And that's also what the syntax would predict. And so we have this boundary here, and it's not clear what we should do with it. And so what I did is I ran an experiment which looked at this juncture effect experimentally for speakers of Connemara Irish. And so I looked specifically at two measures, so pauses, so whether there were pauses that were present and how long they were, and also the duration of the verb and the last word in the subject. And so I looked at two possible locations for this juncture. So between V and S, that would be what I call juncture 1, and S and O, which would be what I would call juncture 2. So we have these two places. The syntax predicts there should be, a boundary between V and S, but the evidence from pauses and such seem to suggest there should be a boundary between S and O. And so in this experiment, I manipulated the length of the subject and object between 1 and 3 words to see sort of what would happen to these pauses and word duration. And so this is what the the experiment design looked like. So basically using things like noun adjective sequences to make the constituents longer or shorter. And so what I found is that there was, in fact, strong evidence for a juncture at J2, so between the subject and object, but really almost no evidence for one at J1, so between the verb and the subject. So what this means is that essentially we see that lengthening and so word lengthening and pauses were very common at J2, and actually they increased in likelihood and duration as the subject and the object got bigger. However, I saw that lengthening and pauses were not present at J1, and it didn't seem to matter how long the subject and the object were. There just was almost never any kind of sort of prosodic break between the verb and the subject. And so if we were just looking at juncture, we would get this result that we would have sort of a very strong boundary between the subject and the object, but a very weak boundary between the verb and the subject. And so if I were to compare these findings, it really does seem that we've got almost like a contradiction. So on the one hand, we've got these pitch accents, which seem to suggest that the verb and the noun are more likely to phrase together when the subject is small. So for example, when it's one word, versus we have this juncture, which would suggest that the verb and the noun always phrase together, while the relative strength of that boundary between the subject and the object is going to actually increase with the size of the subject. So the longer your subject, the bigger that boundary is going to be. And so it seems that these two results are actually at odds with each other. And so we can represent this sort of schematically. So the red boxes are sort of the pitch accent results, while we have this arrow representing the juncture. And basically we can see when it's a small subject, they both sort of agree. So we've got this juncture between subject and object, these two phrase together. But when we have a larger subject, we see that we have a bigger juncture, despite the fact that we've got sort of a weaker boundary. So this is something that's sort of between two nested constituents. And so one way that so there are some ways we could sort of reconcile these findings based on the fact that we know about both of them. And so one idea is that this juncture is actually sort of marking the right edge boundary, so not just any boundary. And so in a sense, it's just another type of diagnostic for the right edge. So in Irish, we would have a left edge diagnostic of L star H and a right edge diagnostic of H star L, and also that final lengthening and pauses. And so what this suggests is that basically if we're looking at, for example, a language that hasn't been described before, we need to take some caution when we're interpreting results. So we can't just basically take a prosodic cue as evidence for things like boundary strength or suggesting that it has to relate to syntactic structure. So basically the presence and strength of this type of juncture doesn't always straightforwardly support other diagnostics. And so one thing I sort of thought about is that this type of pattern actually seems to be close to what has been proposed for factors involving things like speech processing and production planning being involved in these types of breaks that depend on the size of constituents. All right, and so basically what I want to conclude with is just this idea that there's still a lot of questions out there, but it does seem that we can't necessarily equate these ideas about syntax prosody mapping and the role of things like domain juncture and boundary strength. So while they do often work together, and there might be a preference for these things to work together, it's not clear that we can always assume they mean exactly the same thing. And so one question is whether other languages might have a similar type of mismatch that we see in Irish. And so if we just take juncture alone, we can't necessarily make claims about, a large juncture is not necessarily going to equate to a large boundary in the syntax or prosodic structure even. Okay. And so relative strength alone might not be a reliable diagnostic for prosodic structure, and also maybe not a necessary diagnostic. There may be these boundaries which aren't specified at all, and it also may not be sufficient diagnostic. And so what does this mean for theories of the syntax prosody interface? So basically that there may be distinct roles for the mapping of syntactic and prosodic constituents that could be independent of these phonetic or juncture-based types of processes. And we cannot also rely on juncture-based evidence as a type of diagnostic for syntactic structure. And so what I would suggest sort of from this sort of conflict that I've observed in Irish is that we really need to be able to investigate all sides of the problem, right? So if we're looking at a syntax prosody interface in a language that hasn't maybe been described before, ideally we would want to look for independent evidence for syntactic structure, so things like syntactic constituency tests. We'll look for tonal and other types of cues for prosodic domains. We'll look at the phonological weight of constituents, and we'll also look at juncture effects, but also think about things like processing, right? So does this boundary strength sort of equate with things like sentence complexity? And so in conclusion, I've looked at some evidence for prosodic boundaries and really just thought about some of these notions in a slightly more abstract way. And so thinking about what kinds of evidence we can use when we're looking at syntax prosody mapping. And so I've argued that when we're looking at these phenomena at the syntax prosody interface, we shouldn't only look at things like juncture because it may not be as straightforward as we might expect. And so it's important that we can look at different types of cues, as well as thinking about this role of syntactic phrasing in terms of predictions about where these boundaries might occur, as it might provide some insights into these sort of hidden or covert prosodic boundaries. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. So, yep, we are reacting on your talk by sending you applauses. So if you have questions or comments, please send me your name and affiliation using a private chat. That would be good. We have about like 5-10 minutes for question. So let me just have maybe not a clarification question, but a short question. Like most of your data showed like were based on the VSO, the basic word order pattern. Do you, by chance, have this kind of pattern in like DP internal structure, or like when you have adverbs or like in the sentence, like what would happen in those cases? Yeah.
Yeah. So so in terms of the sort of pitch accent cases.
Yeah.
So like this kind of L*H and H*L. Yeah. So there's so in my dissertation work, I looked at some different types of structures. So for example, in terms of complex subjects and objects, things like having more than one adjective or having a possessive structure. I also looked at sentences that had things like an adjunct or an adverb coming after it. And so in terms of these diagnostics, we see that the same patterns sort of arise based on what you predict the structure would be. That being said, once you get to like sort of the more complex your structure is, the more chance there is for variation. So sometimes there's multiple options available. So for example, what I found in some sort of follow-up work that I did is that when we have structures like this, where we have the verb sort of on its own, the more we have sort of in the subject, the more different kinds of phrasings we might observe. So there's some chance for variability between speakers. However, when we get this short subject, so we really get this pattern where all speakers are agreeing, sort of having that same phrasing of the verb and the subject together. So in short sentences, speakers are very consistent. And in longer, more complex sentences, sometimes you get some different patterns, but you can kind of explain them based on sort of where these pitch accents appear. Yeah, so it can give you some idea about what the structure might be.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That's nice that it actually is consistent across all these different schools.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I could tell. Yeah, when I look at things that are more complex, like relative clauses, I remember that's where things got a bit messier. But
yes. Okay, thank you. Next question comes from Natalie, Yale University.
I hope it's okay that I turn on my video. Thanks, Emily. This was really interesting. I have like kind of a basic question, I think, which is what counts as a juncture phenomenon? So you were talking about lengthening at edges and about pauses. Would phonological changes like neutralization also count if they occur across boundaries? Like at what point do we take something to be a juncture phenomenon, and therefore we need to look at it really carefully?
No, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure if I have a really good answer for that. So it's, so I mean, thinking about the types of cues that people use in things like places like psycholinguistics, things like boundary tones definitely come into play there. So if there's something like a falling boundary tone, that can also be taken as a diagnostic, you know, of a boundary, basically. So I mean, I mean, in some sense, I want to say that juncture has to do with sort of things like pauses, but in reality, you know, I guess anything that sort of would relate to just thinking about having that sort of presence of a boundary, and maybe not as related to whether or not there's an edge there. So I kind of think of, I mean, I guess I kind of think of these things like pauses as being something that, you know, it's just a break. It's not really something that has to do with an edge as clearly as something like a falling tone that occurs on the last word of a type of phrase. So it's something I'm still kind of thinking about. But, you know, even in Irish, like, as I said, later, we can still interpret these as being sort of corresponding to each other, right? So if we say that this juncture always occurs at a right edge boundary, then we can kind of, you know, make them, you know, compatible with each other. But it's really when we think about the strength of this boundary, that's where we get sort of the issue. So if we were just looking at how strong that boundary is, we might make different predictions about what the phrasing is.
Yeah, I'm trying to puzzle over it, and it seems like the thing that makes pauses a bit different is that pauses are the same phenomenon at every single type of prosodic boundary, right? Whereas you might get different kinds of boundary tones at the edges. And so, yeah, maybe it's phenomena that need to be indiscriminate between different types of edges, and only different strength. Interesting.
Yeah, and I suppose, yeah, I mean, also maybe, yeah, things that are seem to be more universal. So things like pauses and language, things that may occur in most, if not every language, versus things like pitch accents or types of tones may be more language specific. So yeah.
Thanks, that helps.
Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Then I think sometimes, so the pause was, I think, the main diagnostic for the juncture. But I think in some languages, phonation types, or like, yeah, phonation might actually
like creaky voice or
creaky voice or breathiness towards the end. And I was wondering whether when we see the variability, in particular in the juncture, when people don't pause, in particular with the speech rate, perhaps the phonation types might be showing something that actually marks some kind of boundary. That in the absence of pause. So, do you have any thoughts about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely would fall into the same type of category. And things like pauses, I mean, I don't have the data here, but basically, I mean, not every sentence is going to have a pause. It's sort of more like, you know, maybe 60% of the sentences with, you know, a large subject and object are going to have a pause, a physical pause. But often, even in those cases, you won't get it. It's just sort of more of a likelihood. So you're more likely to get it in a really complex sentence. And so, yeah, so you definitely would expect that, that in the absence of that, you get other things marking it. And that's where things like lengthening might, you know, that's something that does seem to occur regularly. But I think, yeah, things like creaky voice or phonation types would also be a way to mark that. And so we might expect that to occur, you know, maybe in the absence of a physical break.
Right. Yeah. So good. Thank you. Yeah. So let's thank Emily one more time. We will now create a breakout room for everybody to join for any remaining questions or discussion. The recording will now stop. Will be stopped now.